Hi, this is Guy Burgess with the second part of our slideshow series on saving democratic institutions and the challenge that poses for the conflict in peace-building fields. As you may remember from the first slideshow in this series, we were focusing on how to bend the arc of history, again back toward democracy and away from autocracy, anocracy, the kind of chaos of not being able to effectively govern at all, or the risk of civil unrest and war. Or put another way, we were looking at how to make President Biden's quest for national unity a reality. Now this time I want to look at the problem in a somewhat different way, and I think that a good place to start is with a poem that Carl Sandburg wrote many years ago. And the poem imagines two guys, one a landowner and somebody else who's trespassing. And it starts like this. Landowner says, "Hey, get off this estate." "What for?" "Because it's mine." "Well, where'd you get it?" "From my father." "Well, where did he get it?" "From his father." "Well, where did he get it?" "From his father." "Well, where did he get it?" "I fought for it." "Well, I'll fight you for it." And this kind of interaction, I think, has characterized an awful lot of the interactions in human history that have governed the way in which people decide who gets wealth and power. I call them "I'll fight you for it" rules. Now, to some extent, "I'll fight you for it" rules are constructive, they serve Adam Smith's notion of an invisible hand, where competition forces people to strive to be ever better and more productive. But the Founding Fathers knew that there was a dark side to it, which is why they crafted so many checks and balances into the Constitution. There's certainly a sense in which this kind of competition can, instead of being an invisible hand, it can be what Kenneth Boulding used to call an invisible fist, which winds up hurting rather than helping everyone. He was fond of quoting Matthew's law from the biblical book of Matthew, "For whomsoever hath, to him shall be given." Basically the notion that as you accumulate wealth and power, you can use that to accumulate even more wealth and power, driving the level of inequality in a society. Lord Acton took that a step further with his famous line, "Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely." And then you could add to this Charles Darwin and his survival of the fittest, which in this context is the survival of the most ruthless. So folks who are most ruthless in these "I'll fight you for it" rules tend to come out on top. And that's why conflicts through history have been so destructive. What you've set up with these "I'll fight you for it" rules is a kind of winner-take-all, and of equal importance, the notion loser loses all conflicts, that force the parties to fully use all available types of power, no matter how abhorrent. And this is responsible for an awful lot of history's great atrocities and great tragedies. This is what led us to eras of conquest, this map of how the European empires pretty much occupied the entire planet. The map in the lower right is a map of the Native American reservations in the United States. And you can certainly see that they were pushed again through an act of conquest, and certainly Nazi Germany was yet another effort to conquer the world. The other thing that accompanies this drive for conquest is a dehumanization of one's opponents. I mean, you can't really be ruthless if you see the other side in human terms. So, and these are just two of zillions of examples that are out there. The era of segregation, where colored people in the United States were even forced to have different drinking fountains. You'll notice that their drinking fountain isn't cooled. And then, of course, this is Auschwitz and the Holocaust, which is as extreme a form of dehumanization as you're likely to find. And this kind of conflict continues into the 21st century, where we have new kinds of conquest and domination and war that and for want of a better term, might be called hybrid warfare. This is the whole range of tactics, which include very sophisticated propaganda and manipulation that lie sort of just below the level of outright, what they sometimes call kinetic warfare or real violence. But you see this in Russia's hybrid warfare. China's surveillance state is downright scary. And if you look at the state of political conflict in the United States, you see a lot of the same elements, though thankfully not yet as severe, but it certainly could get that way. Now, in this context, you can think of liberal democracy as an effort to get beyond these "I'll fight you for it" rules. This excellent article by Francis Fukuyama just recently came out, and it traces this all the way back to the end of the great religious wars in Europe, and how there's been this back and forth slow struggle to establish liberal ideals and democracy, and to establish them in first Western European society, then around the world, as an alternative to "I'll fight you for it" rules. So in this sense, liberal democracy can be seen as a system for wisely and equitably and nonviolently managing a world composed of people who have deeply held and often incompatible cultural beliefs, and who are in competition, inevitably, for scarce resources. Now, the goal of democracy is, in this context, I think this is an interesting and a productive way to look at it, is to restrain the invisible fist and provide a wise and equitable alternative to these "I'll fight you for it" rules. That's what we were trying to do with the Constitution. And Biden's inauguration, they made a lot out of the line that in the preamble to the Constitution, they talk about a more perfect union. That is something that you continue to work on over time. They certainly didn't think they had it way back then, and we don't yet have it, but it is a way to try to maximize individual freedom, protect the commons, prevent violence by preserving the rule of law, and in general, prevent autocracy, anocracy, and war. Now, the peace-building field's sort of in the same business. Now, peace-building sort of started out as this kind of wacky peacenik thing, but it's grown increasingly respectable, as evidenced by the United States Institute of Peace building, which is really quite an impressive edifice that tells you how much more of a role it has in U.S. political thought. This is just across from the Lincoln Memorial. Another way to think about this is Kenneth Boulding, again, his book on stable peace. And his notion was that we have peace, and here we're trying to build peace, as a situation in which the possibility that disputes will be resolved through violent means or through these newfangled hybrid political warfare tactics is so small that it doesn't enter into anybody's calculations. And the sad fact is we're a long way from that now. Now, in order to make this kind of peace building work, you need some sort of peaceful democratic underlying culture. Right now we're spending a lot of effort celebrating diversity. But what we need underlying that, and this is something I think we need to work a lot harder to develop, is a commonality that binds this diversity together. Now, it needs to have a number of sort of key elements. They're all relatively obvious, but very, very important. The notion that we need to tolerate people who are different. We need to agree to coexist with them without trying to change them. We need mutual respect. Everybody needs the freedom to live how they want, and the security to not have people always trying to change the way they want to live. Another way to think about this is Burton and Maslow's human needs theory, that what we need, and this I think we ought to be able to agree on, a set of underlying cultural principles that everybody's basic human needs ought to be satisfied. Not necessarily that the state satisfies them, but there is some mechanism through which this can be done. Now, this is running into conflict a bit between the sort of social justice advocates and the peace advocates, and they're not the same thing, and we really need both. Now, Mary Ann Glendon, and this book's now, I guess, almost 30 years old, but it still raises a really important point, that what we started to do, and we've been doing over the last many decades, and that she first noticed here, is that we've started to phrase our aspirations and our grievances in terms of fundamental rights, that my side is entitled to, has a right to this, that, and the other thing, and if the other side doesn't give it to us, then they're just evil, they're not negotiable. And that tends to frame this effort to produce a more perfect union into a black and white contest between those who have rights and those who are denying those rights. And this has become a focal point for the big political conflicts that we're facing in the United States, and there are parallels to this, I'm sure, in many, many countries around the world. Here we have the notion of protected classes. Now, on the political left, over the last many decades, there has been an increasing recognition. There are a large number of groups who are historically marginalized, who, in this new expanded language of rights, whose fundamental rights are being denied either on the basis of race, religion, national origin, age, sex, and so on and so forth. It's also written into the law with agencies like the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission. And the Democratic constituencies on the left are sort of constantly pushing for more and more protections for these groups. And at one level that makes lots of sense, but at another level it's produced a backlash from what you might call the protected from classes. When you're protecting one class of people, the assumption is that these other folks are the bad guys that are trying to do terrible things to them, and they need to be stopped. And the protected from class tend to think of themselves as being unfairly accused and penalized, and that's a big part of the energy that Donald Trump was able to harness, and part of why our conflicts in this country are getting ever more intense. So this raises a question of whether we are reverting to some new version of I'll fight you for it rules, in which the left and the right are increasingly using all available instruments of power, in many ways, no matter how abhorrent or illegitimate, to try to force the other side to relent. Dehumanization is making a comeback. If you look, and this article is kind of a good retrospective of the Trump years, the way in which he has dehumanized his political opponents. And to a considerable degree, the same thing has happened on the political left and the cancel culture, that anybody who dares question any of these fundamental rights that are being pushed can quickly find themselves ostracized, blackballed from employment, and it's the same kind of hardball politics. And this is taking us back again to all-out us versus them politics, which is very much a zero-sum. Somebody's going to win and somebody's going to lose. And that, I think, tends to not take us toward justice, but something that's much less sustainable. You have a pendulum that goes back and forth, where a new president like Biden is coming into power trying as fast as he can to undo everything that Trump did, which he tried to do as fast as he can to undo everything that Obama did. And in the midst of all the chaos, the commons is being neglected. Let's take climate change, for example. So an alternative is a more inclusive way of phrasing justice. So it's not, taking things from one group and giving it from the other, but satisfying everyone's human needs. We wrote an essay on this for Beyond Intractability, on what I call the disproportionality trap. And there's also a counter-trap associated with it. Here's a new book that tries to raise the same set of issues. But I think what we really need to do, if we're going to bend the arc of history back again towards democracy, is to find a way of phrasing these justice issues in positive-sum win-win terms, that everybody has an interest in making sure that everybody has an ability to meet their basic human needs. If we can do that, then we can start to transform things.